My parents charged me rent, kicked me out to make room for my golden child brother, and now they're after my grandparents' inheritance. Hello, I'm an 18-year-old female, and I'm reaching out for advice about a really upsetting situation with my family. For some context, my family consists of me, my mom, dad, and my older brother, who I'll call Dylan for this story. The events I'm about to share have been building up for years, and things recently came to a head in the most unbelievable way. To start, I always felt like the odd one out in my family. Dylan, who is 6 years older than me, has always been my parents' golden child, and it was no secret. My parents had a hard time conceiving him, so when he was born, he was their miracle baby. Dylan excelled in everything. School, sports, extracurriculars, you name it. My parents couldn't stop gushing about how wonderful and talented he was. Naturally, when I came along, the bar was set impossibly high. The problem was, I had different interests. While I'm not an overachiever like Dylan, I've always been passionate about art, something my parents never valued or even tried to understand. They saw art as a hobby rather than something worth pursuing. And because I didn't meet the same academic or athletic expectations as Dylan, I was treated like the family failure. I can't count the number of times I was subtly, and not so subtly, compared to Dylan. Growing up, the favoritism was so blatant that even our extended family noticed. I remember one Christmas when I was about 5, we were all sitting around the tree, opening presents. I spotted a large box under the tree and naturally grabbed it, thinking it was mine. My mom tried to persuade me to pick a smaller gift, but I held onto the bigger one, excited to see what was inside. That's when my dad intervened, snatching the box from me in front of everyone. He handed it to Dylan, and I was given a small box containing yet another dress, one of the many I already had. Dylan unwrapped his gift to find a telescope, something thoughtful and special, while I sat there, disappointed. My grandparents saw what happened and, the next day, sent me a beautiful dollhouse as a way to make up for the unfairness of that moment. From that day forward, they were the only people who truly supported me and saw me for who I was. Fast forward a few years, and by the time I was 13, Dylan had just graduated high school and was headed off to a prestigious college. My parents were over the moon about it and decided to move to a bigger, fancier house in a suburban, upper-class neighborhood. I wasn't thrilled about the move, especially since it meant being farther away from my grandparents, who had always been my safe haven. But, as usual, my opinion didn't matter much. And the move happened. My parents had saved a considerable amount of money for Dylan's education, and they also took out a hefty mortgage for the new house. Meanwhile, I was just starting high school and feeling more invisible than ever. Despite the distance between us, I wanted to show Dylan that I was proud of him for getting into college. I saved up my allowance and bought him a watch as a congratulatory gift. I'll never forget the moment he smiled at me when I gave it to him. But before he could say anything, my dad swooped in, took the watch away, and said Dylan didn't need it since he had already bought him a branded one. Dylan didn't say a word, and I was left heartbroken. From that point on, I stopped trying to be close to my brother or to win my parents' approval. Dinner conversations became unbearable. Every night, it was the same story. My parents going on and on about how well Dylan was doing in college, how proud they were of him, and how much he was achieving. Meanwhile, I was barely a blip on their radar. The constant comparison was exhausting, and I often cried to my grandparents about how isolated and unappreciated I felt. I even begged them to let me live with them instead of my parents, but my parents refused, insisting that I'd be spoiled if I stayed with my grandparents. In my state, it's legal to start working at the age of 14, and my parents wasted no time reminding me of that. On my 14th birthday, instead of celebrating, they sat me down for a serious talk. They suggested I get a part-time job to cover my own expenses because, according to them, money was tight due to the new house and Dylan's college costs. They made sure to emphasize that I was now old enough to start contributing. The funny thing was, they always seemed to have enough money to cover Dylan's needs, but suddenly, when it came to me, they were struggling. It didn't feel right, but I kept quiet. I found a job at a local bookstore where I worked extra hours to make more than the average teenager. My grandparents were proud of me, but they also expressed concern about how my parents were treating me, wishing I could move out sooner rather than later. Around this time, Dylan was beginning to struggle at college. He had started dating someone, and his grades were slipping. My parents were frustrated and took it out on me, which was nothing new. Then one day, they hit me with another surprise. They told me that, given the financial strain of paying for the new house and Dylan's expenses, I should start contributing rent money from my part-time job. They framed it as teaching me responsibility, but I knew it was just another way to offload their problems onto me. I didn't argue. Instead, I went to my room and quietly processed what had just happened. I told my grandparents, who were furious. They called my parents and had a huge fight, accusing them of being unfair and unreasonable. But my parents doubled down, telling me that if I didn't want to pay rent, I could find another place to live. I thought about moving in with my grandparents, but their house was too far from my school, and I didn't want to burden them in their old age. So I reluctantly agreed to start paying rent. The next 2 years were painfully quiet. I kept to myself, stopped eating dinner with my family, and threw myself into my schoolwork and my job. I was determined to get into a good art school, and that goal kept me going. My parents didn't seem to care about anything as long as they were getting their monthly rent payments from me. Dylan, meanwhile, had graduated college but wasn't doing well. His relationship had derailed his academic performance, and he couldn't find a good job. My parents were pressuring him to come home, but instead of listening, he disappeared for 2 days, only to resurface and announce that he had married his girlfriend in Las Vegas. My parents were livid, to say the least. They hated his girlfriend and were convinced she was the reason for all his problems. The house became a war zone, with constant arguments about Dylan's impulsive decision to get married. I couldn't have cared less. I was focused on my final year of high school, preparing for art school, and trying to survive in that toxic environment. I spent more and more time at my grandparents' house, finding solace in their warmth and support. Then, just before my finals, everything fell apart. Dylan's marriage didn't last long, and he ended up getting divorced. My parents were thrilled, blaming his now ex-wife for everything that had gone wrong in his life. They demanded that I help pay for their trip to Dillon City to bring him back home, but I refused. I wasn't going to fund their poor decisions or Dylan's mess of a life. My refusal didn't go over well, but they found the money elsewhere and brought Dylan home. Here's the kicker. Our new house only had 2 bedrooms. When Dylan came back, my parents told me I had to give up my room for him and move into the living room until I left for college. Their reasoning? I'd be gone soon anyway, so it didn't matter if I had a room or not. I was stunned by their complete disregard for my needs, especially since I was still paying rent. I told them that I wasn't moving out of my room just to make space for Dylan, especially not with my finals coming up. Their response? If you don't like it, you can go live with your grandparents, but you'll still have to pay rent since your stuff will be here. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own family was treating me like I was disposable. Dylan, the golden child, didn't say a word to defend me. That was the final straw. I packed my essentials, called a cab, and left for my grandparents' house. As I walked out the door, I told my parents they could do whatever they wanted with the rest of my things, but I wasn't paying them another penny. I arrived at my grandparents' house, and they welcomed me with open arms. When my parents called, demanding to know where I was, my grandparents lied, saying I wasn't there. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I went no contact with my parents and focused on my finals. I ended up doing well, passing with good grades, and applied to several colleges. One day, I came home to find my parents sitting in my grandparents' living room waiting for me. My mom was crying, and my dad was visibly angry. They accused me of abandoning them when they needed me the most, blaming me for their financial troubles since I had stopped paying rent. My dad called me the worst daughter ever, which was rich considering how they'd treated me all my life. Before I could respond, my grandfather stepped in. He unleashed years of pent-up frustration, telling my parents exactly how he felt about their treatment of me. He called them out for their blatant favoritism, for making me pay rent while supporting Dylan's every whim, and for kicking me out of the house. My parents tried to defend themselves, but Grandpa wasn't having it. He told them that because of their behavior, he had decided to leave their share of his inheritance to me. My parents were stunned into silence. They started begging and pleading, trying to convince my grandparents to change their minds, but my grandma stood her ground, reminding them that they had brought this upon themselves by treating me so poorly. My parents, still in shock, turned to me for sympathy, but I wasn't having it. They didn't even apologize for the horrible things they'd said to me. They just expected me to forgive and forget because we're family. I'd had enough. I calmly told them that they didn't deserve a daughter like me and that maybe they should turn to Dylan for help since he was their favorite. At that, my parents completely lost it. They started screaming, calling me names, and saying they wished I'd never been born. My grandparents kicked them out, threatening to call the police if they didn't leave immediately. After they were gone, I broke down in tears, thanking my grandparents for always being there for me when my parents weren't. They reassured me that they had made up their minds long ago and that I didn't owe my parents anything. Update 1. To everyone who supported me after my first post, thank you. I've realized that cutting ties with my parents was the right decision, even if it was painful. I'd like to pick up where I left off. After my parents were kicked out of my grandparents' house, they made a few half-hearted attempts to contact me, but I ignored them. I knew they weren't reaching out because they cared about me. They just wanted to guilt-trip me into helping them financially. My grandparents stood firm in their decision to leave me the inheritance, and my parents were furious. A few weeks passed without any drama, and I started to feel like I could finally breathe. I was still living with my grandparents and waiting to hear back from the colleges I'd applied to. One day, as I was coming home from a part-time job I'd picked up to save money for school, I was shocked to find my parents sitting in the living room again. They had the nerve to show up unannounced after everything that had happened. My mom immediately started crying when she saw me. And my dad, in his usual angry tone, began berating me for being an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned them in their time of need. They claimed that ever since I left, they'd been struggling to pay the mortgage on the new house. They had been counting on my rent money to make ends meet, and now that I wasn't paying, they were in financial trouble. I couldn't believe the audacity. Not once did they acknowledge the pain they'd caused me, the way they'd treated me like a burden, or the fact that they'd kicked me out of my own home so Dylan could move in. Instead, they were trying to guilt me into feeling sorry for them. My grandparents, bless them, weren't having any of it. My grandfather laid into my dad again, reminding him that he had treated me horribly for years, always putting Dylan first and never showing me the same love and support. My parents tried to argue, but Grandpa shut them down. He told them that he and Grandma had already decided to give me their share of the inheritance because they didn't trust my parents to do right by me. My parents were furious. They started pleading with my grandparents, but Grandma cut them off, saying that karma had finally caught up with them. They turned to me, still expecting sympathy, but I stood my ground. I told them that I wasn't responsible for their financial problems, and that maybe they should have thought about the consequences of their actions before kicking me out. I reminded them that they had a golden child who they'd always prioritized over me, and maybe Dylan could help them out now. That's when my dad completely lost it. He started screaming at me, calling me names and saying he wished I'd never been born. My grandparents had heard enough and kicked them out of the house. I was shaken by the whole encounter, but I felt a sense of relief knowing that my grandparents had my back. Update 2. After that confrontation with my parents, things were quiet for a while. I focused on my finals, applied to more colleges, and waited for responses. One day, I received an email from Dylan. He said he didn't have my phone number and asked if we could meet up for lunch to talk. I was hesitant at first, but after thinking about it, I decided to give him a chance. Maybe he had finally realized how messed up things were. We met at a local cafe, and I immediately noticed how tired and disheveled he looked. He seemed nervous, and the conversation started off awkwardly. After a few minutes of small talk, he finally opened up. Dylan told me that ever since our parents found out they weren't getting any inheritance from our grandparents, things at home had gone downhill fast. They were constantly fighting, and the house had become a complete mess. Dylan had moved out temporarily and was crashing with a friend. He went on to say that he had secretly met up with his ex-wife a few months ago, and now she was pregnant. She wanted to keep the baby and possibly rekindle their relationship. That's when he dropped the bombshell. He wanted to know if I would give him and our parents some of my inheritance money. He said it would help them get back on their feet and give him a fresh start as a father. I was stunned. After everything that had happened, Dylan had the audacity to ask me for money. I couldn't believe it. I told him that he had no right to ask me for anything, especially after standing by while our parents treated me like garbage. I reminded him that he had never stood up for me, never tried to defend me, and never cared about my well-being. I got up and walked out, leaving him sitting there, speechless. When I got home and told my grandparents what had happened, they were disappointed but not surprised. They had hoped that Dylan might be different from our parents, but as they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Update 3. After my blow-up with Dylan, my grandparents decided to get to the bottom of everything. They invited my parents over for a conversation. Dylan was still staying with them while he looked for a job, so he was there too. Grandpa sat them down and asked them about the education fund he had set up for both me and Dylan. It turns out my parents had full control over that money, and instead of using it for our education, they had blown it all on themselves. They had used the fund to finance their lifestyle while expecting me to start paying rent as soon as I was old enough to work. I was furious. My parents tried to defend themselves, saying they needed the money at the time, but I wasn't interested in their excuses. I told them that I was done with them and that I didn't want anything to do with them anymore. Dylan apologized again for not being there for me, and he said he wanted to make amends. I told him it would take time, but I was willing to try. Update 4. It's been about a month since I moved into my college dorm, and life is so much better. I'm finally free from my parents' toxic influence, and I've been adjusting well to college life. I'm still in touch with my grandparents, who continue to support me in every way possible. Dylan is still staying with them, and it seems like he's trying to turn his life around. He's been looking for a job, and my grandparents have been helping him out. My parents, on the other hand, are still trying to badmouth me to anyone who will listen. They even tried to post online about how ungrateful I was, but most people saw through their lies and sided with me. My grandparents had a good laugh about it and reassured me that I had made the right decision by cutting ties with them. A few days ago, Grandpa told me something that floored me. He revealed that he had set up a fund for my education when I was in middle school, but my parents had control over it. I had no idea this fund even existed because my parents never told me about it. Instead, they made me believe that I had to pay for everything myself, including rent, while they used my education fund to pay for their luxuries. Hearing this only reinforced my decision to go no contact with them for good. Even though it hurts to think about how selfish and manipulative my parents have been, I'm grateful to have my grandparents in my corner. They've been my true family, and I'm dedicating my first professional art collection to them as a thank you for everything they've done for me. Thank you for watching! If you enjoyed our stories and would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you captivating tales and new content every week. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We appreciate every one of you for being a part of our storytelling journey.